Assuming you've read the chapter on the Indian Child Welfare Act, I'll ask you some questions about that. Admittedly, the Indian Child, chapter 23 is one chapter that I had never really covered in this course. I just, for want of time, I've always tried to pull a few of these chapters in because we just never could get to everything. But I went ahead and scheduled it this time and started, and I read the chapter, and I was totally swept up in the stories and wound up listening to the oral arguments of both the Supreme Court cases this weekend. And I spent like half a day on one of them, I think, listening to the oral arguments. And I'm, kicking myself saying, why didn't I cover this earlier? Because it's so geographical. So let me go ahead and open this up for you so you can see this. Before we get started, you all have any announcements you need to, or questions or anything? Everything going well? Having a good week? Had a good weekend, hopefully? Okay. Jay is under the weather. She won't be here tonight, but we've got this recording. So, all right. So the Indian Child Welfare Act. So what prompted the Indian Child Welfare Act? What was the, usually there's some kind of issue that Congress picks up, or, in the case of sometimes the Justice Department will prompt Congress to get some legislation to fix something. What was the case here? It's a hot day. I'm getting tired of wearing a tie.
It was a quarter to a third of the children in Indian families were being taken away.
Why were they being taken away? Of course, that's the reason.
Well, generally on the reservations, in general, Native populations were very poor, so the social workers would come in and being uncultured, unaware that it'd be okay for a grandma or uncle or aunt or cousin to watch the kid while mom and dad were off doing something. It just basically cultural misunderstanding and social conditions.
Well, you have to admit also that there's a lot of poor,
a lot of money.
Poor populations are often the ones that are strapped with a lot of family issues, right? In this case, the complaint was by a lot of people. The tribes were claiming that the state agencies, Department of Human Services, Child Protective Services especially, were very active in removing children from their homes on reservations in particular. But the problem was that when they would remove them out of these rural areas, they would often place them with people who were culturally very, very different. And sometimes these would lead to adoptions. I can give you an example of this actually from the 1920s in my family. My wife, ex-wife now, her grandmother, okay, her grandmother was taken from her mother, who was a single mother raising several kids, at the behest of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And Bureau of Indian Affairs, caseworkers were going around rural Northeast Oklahoma and found these kids living in poverty. And so, you know, and the story that I was told was that the caseworker sort of explained to the mother that things would be much better if she would relinquish her custody of the child and place her with or actually that in those days it was put her into a boarding school in Tahlequah, and this happened to be Sequoia Indian boarding school in Tahlequah. So she was placed there, and I think it was she was 9 years old or maybe 8 years old when they placed her there, and then she left at around age 13 or 14. And when she went in, she spoke only Cherokee, and when she came out, she only spoke English. And although she retained her Cherokee, she never spoke it except to other people, other Cherokee people, and never around anybody who wasn't, never around whites. So that was an example, and she never had animosity about that. She always, when I visited with her about it in her 80s, she always explained that, well, that was about the best thing that her mother could do for her, was allow her, because she wouldn't, her mother wasn't able to really put food on the table. Ultimately this kind of leads back to a gender thing, to a women's rights issue, because the man had left her. And so anyway, that's one example. And of course, there are many other examples of children being adopted and placed in foster homes, this sort of thing. And I can also say that another family example of my own involves my father's side of the family, and my father's youngest sister, my aunt, who's still alive. In the 1960s, early 60s, when she lived around Burns Flat, Oklahoma, her husband was an Air Force pilot. Adopted an Arapaho boy, and so even though I wasn't around him very much because they moved to Colorado, but I have a cousin who is full-blood Arapaho he's adopted, and that's an example of a white person, a white family adopting an Indian child. And that was very common in the 60s and the 70s for some strange reason. But anyway, it was a pattern. And over time, of course, the native tribes began to realize that, hey, reservation land, reservation life tends to be impoverished. Impoverished people are getting impoverished people on the reservation are getting relocated to non-Indian families, and certainly not within our tribe. So one of the problems, of course, is that reservations, Native American people in general, are small populations and very rural populations, the most rural of any group in the United States. And placing a child into foster care and pre-adoptive care is something that is usually easier in a city, So, and for other reasons, the adoption process, the foster care system tends to be located where there are more people, right? So it's kind of like brain drain. It's sort of like a one-way movement of population to the detriment of the original population, So there I'm not really talking much about the legislative issues that came about, but this was passed in 1978 by a fairly liberal Congress, and during the Carter administration. And it is a law that was intended to have positive effects on the Indian tribes by keeping their children from being swept away by adult protective services of the state and by being lost to adoptions. With that, if you look at the background material here, this is not really discussed so much in your text, but Congress actually identified 4 factors in working toward the Indian Child Welfare Act and writing it up. And those, well, the obvious thing was that American Indian children had far higher removal rates than any other group. And that is, there were far larger percentages of Native American children who were being placed into state foster care, all right, because of whatever reason. And the reasons that Congress identified in studying this and developing the Indian Child Welfare Act, they identified 4 reasons. And that was, number 1, a lack of culturally informed state standards for assessing fitness of Native families. And that's kind of what you're getting at, Gail, there. The DHS workers would, not, I don't know if any of you have ever worked with DHS in any way, hopefully not in a bad way. I had an experience with DHS not long ago. It was primarily with adult protective services having to do with a dying parent with Alzheimer's. And in this case, there was an issue with one of my step siblings, not relinquishing the resources that he was supposed to be relinquishing for the care of this parent. And so we wound up getting adult protective services involved with this. Actually, I didn't do it, but another sibling did this. And adult protective services like child protective services, these are people who have a heck of a lot of legal power. They are generally acting as agents of the courts, and they have the ability basically to subpoena bank records, all kinds of stuff. I didn't realize this until I experienced, I was kind of in on it. And I was just flabbergasted by the fact that, they basically had more pull than the cops, almost like a district attorney or something. In fact, they work directly with the district attorney. So basically what I'm saying is that the state really has an enormous amount of power when it comes to the welfare of children or the welfare of the elderly. So Native American families were being very unequally subjected to child relocations and custody issues from the state. The Congress also recognized that in many cases, and I'm sure Oklahoma was one, the states typically did not take much, they didn't take pains to consider the rights of the tribes when trying to make sure that children were safe. Okay. And so that led to all sorts of due process violations. And you all know this by now, that states, when they're throwing their weight around with with Indian tribes, half the time people who are involved working for the state may not have a clue about how how things are different in Indian country. So lots of due process violations with regard to states infringing on tribal jurisdictions. Okay. And number three, there were economic incentives that favored the removal of Indian children from their families and communities. I'll show you an example of that in a second. And of course, poverty in Indian country. And Native American poverty is not just limited to reservation land. Although eastern and southern Oklahoma, what I'm thinking of, is now reservation land. So here's another example, a strange example of, this is not mentioned in your book, but it's a program that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church of the Mormons, a program they had beginning in the 50s. It was mostly active during the 60s and the 70s. And this was if you're familiar with the Lamanites, you know who the Lamanites are according to the Mormons? Tessa is no, or is that a yes or no? Okay. Micah, you do. Can you explain this for us?
I'm trying to remember because it's like they're the Gentiles, but it includes Jews. Everybody.
No, they're not. They're not Gentiles.
They're not. Oh, okay. So they're the ones who are not Gentiles. So it's yeah. I remember you talking about it, but
okay, they were yeah. Have you ever heard of the Lost Tribes of Israel? According to the Book of Mormon, there were two tribes that wound up in North America. One had light skin, one had darker skin. The darker skinned group were the Lamanites. The Lamanites had suffered the wrath of God, so they were turned dark, according to the Book of Mormon. And but they are, according to the Mormon beliefs, the Native Americans in general are really Jewish. Okay, they're really the lost tribes of Israel. So the Mormon Church has a very different point of view towards Native Americans. The placement program, it's also referred to as the Indian Child Placement Program or something like that. But they had this program that actively sought primarily Navajo children because fairly close to the Navajo, and I guess also probably the Utes and a few other groups in the Great Basin area. They would take Native children into their homes, baptize them, convert them to LDS, educate them in, of course, state-run, which are white and Mormon schools in Utah. And around 50,000 children are estimated to have gone through these programs, and mostly the 60s and the 70s. They were intending to help develop leadership among Native Americans and, of course, assimilate them for their own good. The church, as it often did, identified certain families to take on these challenges, these tasks, by calling them. If you were called, that means you got your marching orders from the church, from Salt Lake City. And basically these were well-to-do families, but the cost of supporting the children was not something that was covered by the state, like a foster program. It was all private. The program, of course, fell into decline after the the 70s, and it was officially removed, officially discontinued in 1996. I don't think it probably continued into the 90s, but nevertheless, that was one example. It was kind of a religious-based, an attempt by a religious group, ethnic group really, to take in Indian children. So let's look at the Indian Child Welfare Act a little closer. The long title is an act to establish the standards, or an act to establish standards for the placement of Indian children in foster or adoptive homes to prevent the breakup of Indian families and for other purposes. What it did was it gave tribal governments exclusive jurisdiction over children who reside or are domiciled within Indian country. What does domicile mean? What's your domicile? Let's look it up. Somewhere between document and dowry. Domicile, the place where an individual has his permanent home or principal establishment, to where, whenever he is absent, he has the intention of returning. One technical preeminent headquarters, which as a result, either of fact or of fiction, every person is compelled to have, in order that by aid of it, certain rights and duties which have been attached to it by the law may be determined. A business or a corporation may have a domicile, which refers to the place where the establishment is maintained or where the governing power of the corporation is exercised. For purposes of taxation, it is often a principal place of business. So a domicile is not necessarily where you are at the time. It's not your location. Right now, I'm in the Social Sciences and Humanities building here on the southwest corner of campus. It's not my domicile, okay? I'm here a lot, but it's not my domicile. Sometimes I spend more time here than at my actual domicile, but not during the summer. So the domicile is, basically your legal address, your the place where you live, where you stay. So in this case, or in the Indian Child Welfare Act, so basically domicile is geography. It's a place, right? The act gives the tribal government exclusive jurisdiction over children who are within Indian country, on reservation domiciles. The attempt to reverse the rate of removal of children by the federal and state child welfare authorities, mostly state, from homes in Indian country and resultant alienation of Native children from extended families and tribal culture. That's the purpose of the Indian Child Welfare Act, an attempt to reverse that high rate of removal of children by federal and state child welfare authorities. All right, do you see any issues coming up? Do you see any problems with this? Does it sound good?
In theory, it sounds good, but there's going to be lots of issues.
Yeah, that's usually the problem, isn't it? In theory, it sounds, on paper, it looks great. In practice, maybe not so much. Here are a couple of items. Number one, starting with adoptions. Adoptions under the Indian Child Welfare Act require that if an adoption is taking place through the state, then the state has to give preference, in the absence of any good cause to the contrary, to a placement with, number one, this is kind of in hierarchy. Number one, a member of the child's extended family. Okay. Number two, other members of the child's tribe. And number three, other Indian families. Now, the whole idea there is to keep the child nearby, really in Indian country, close to Indian country. What if you were playing the devil's advocate? Place yourself in this situation, or place a family member in this situation. Maybe you've even had an example from your own life experience where you might think about this and say, wait a minute, in my example, that would not be a good idea necessarily. Can you think of any examples like that?
Like abuse or going back into an impoverished home, just because it's with a family member doesn't mean it's great. Like I have extended family members that I would not want to live with if I had to. So.
Amen to that. So yeah, extended family, that could be, weird old Uncle Rex or whatever his name is, who you don't really trust, if you have maybe two parents who or one parent who maybe has such problems at the time that they can't adequately care for a child or maybe several children, then moving that child to another family member may not be the best thing to do, right? They may not have the security that they might if they were moved elsewhere. How about number two? You think of any possible problems with that? Not that there are going to be always problems, but some possible problems.
What's to say that just a random member of the tribe is just as good as the extended family? Hopefully they're doing some sort of a background check or counseling or preparing these people.
Okay. And in many cases, let's take, like, say, for example, we're talking about somebody who is a member of the Tonkawa tribe, up near Tonkawa, Oklahoma. It's a really small population, really small tribe, okay? Taking a child from a parent or parents and placing them with someone a mile away because they're a member of the tribe, it's probably not going to change much of the problem. And not only that, the parent may simply go get the kid anyway. And, there's not necessarily going to be a safety of keeping them within that same area. All right. Well, that's probably enough being devil's advocate. So that's the adoption side of this. Okay. So I don't think about adoption now. Okay. If someone loses custody of the child, they're maybe they're going to prison or something. They lose custody of the child, or they're perhaps, say a heroin addict or something, and they lose custody, and the child is only moving a mile or two or three away, and is adopted by somebody right there. That's really not removing the child at all. And then not only that, but think about the impact on the parent. The parent will have lost a child to someone else who, this is like a recipe for all kinds of other problems. That's my opinion. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a social worker. Just a private citizen. All right, foster care and adoptions follow these four, this hierarchy of four things. First of all, according to the law, the tribe or the child must go to a member of the Indian child's extended family, or if not that, next is a foster home license approved or specified by the Indian child's tribe. Then an Indian foster home license or approved by an authorized non-Indian licensing authority, or then an institution for children approved by an Indian tribe or operated by an Indian organization which has a program suitable to meet the Indian child's needs. So what do you think of that? Now, often, I don't know a lot about the foster care system, nor adoption for that matter. But what I do know about the foster care system is kids have a tendency to move through foster homes a lot. I mean that's the stories I always get. I've had a lot of students who were foster children, and maybe had a new family they lived with every year or two. And sometimes those foster families were exploitive. They were just there to get the check that came with the child. So again, I'm not saying that this is a bad law. I'm not saying, I really don't know. I mean, what's the record of the Indian Child Welfare Act so far? All I really know about it is what I read in textbooks. Okay. And there are just two cases that really stand out. And these are always cited, not just in your textbook, but they're typically cited in this one. They're typically cited in, if I look at I'm trying to be fair here, okay? If I go to, the Canby book, I think he covers the Indian Child Welfare Act. Nope, he doesn't. But I'd have to look it up to see, what he says about this. And undoubtedly, he's going to talk about Mississippi Band of Choctaws, right? Which is the case that you read, right? So Mississippi Choctaw Indians, this is the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, which has a small reservation, I think around 4,000 to 5,000 people at the most, around the town of Philadelphia, Mississippi. If you're not familiar with the great state of Mississippi, Philadelphia is more toward the northern part of the state, and Gulfport's down on the coast. Gulfport gets overrun by hurricanes every few decades. When I lived in Mississippi, Gulfport got wiped out by Hurricane Camille, but they rebuilt it. So in this case, the biological parents were young unmarried kids, lived on the reservation. She got pregnant with twins, and what did they do? They made an arrangement with, I guess, a couple who they knew who were not living on the reservation. They're living in Gulfport, probably Mr. and Mrs. Holyfield are their names. That's all we really know. They arranged ahead of time for these people to take the children, to take these twins. So knowing about the Indian Child Welfare Act, the couple intentionally left the reservation so as to give birth off reservation. So they went to Gulfport. The would-be adoptive parents paid for hospital costs, paid for the court costs of adoption. And the twins were born December 29th, 1985. And I think the adoptive parents took custody in early, like first week of January, 1986. Everybody was happy. Well, I don't think you can be that happy necessarily, but at least they were, they got what they were intended to do. So the birth mother and the biological father returned to Philadelphia, and the state of Mississippi approved the adoption procedure. It took place outside of Indian country. Custody was transferred right after the birth using the state courts Harrison County, or Harris County, Mississippi, actually. And state of Mississippi obviously had violated the requirements of the Indian Child Welfare Act. This was in 1985. Plenty of time for the state to have, considered what was going on here, but I suppose it was not even probably never even crossed their minds. Probably assumed that because it was taking place in Harris County outside of Indian country, that there was no issue. And that's clearly what the biological parents wanted to do. So what happened was the tribe filed suit against the adoptive parents, hence Mississippi Choctaw Indians versus Holyfield. So in this, this was the concurring opinion written by Justice William Brennan. In this finding, the Supreme Court, and I'm not sure exactly how it got to the. You all recall? Do you read about that? How it got to the Supreme Court? Was it taken by cert, or was it challenged at in federal district court first? What was the origin, the place of origin?
I don't think it really tells us.
Well, I think it was certiorari. So anyway, the Supreme Court got it pretty quick, and what did the Supreme Court do? They recognized that the tribal courts had jurisdiction over Mississippi, over the state court, regardless of the location of the child's birth. Even, well, in this case, if biological parents were domiciled on reservation. So because the biological parents had their domicile on the reservation, I guess the reservation followed them. Indian country followed them wherever they went. Because they were Indians from, living in Indian country, didn't matter the location of the birth. The children had never even been on the reservation yet. They were within the jurisdiction of the tribal court. I just think that's strange. I mean, what about?
I love the dissent on it. One was like, it can't be there because the kid has never actually been on the reservation.
Yeah.
It was like,
well, okay, maybe in utero.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. The kid hasn't actually physically itself.
I mean, in Oklahoma, life begins with, life begins at conception. In a few months, it'll be life begins with a glint in the guy's eye. Okay. Whatever. So April 3rd, 1989, the court declares, this is the high court, declares the adoption invalid and remands it to the tribal court. The twins are 3 years and 3 months of age at this point, okay? Can you imagine what the adoptive parents are going through with all this? Thinking that, the court's going to take their children away. But that's not what happened. The tribal court decided to give custody to the adoptive parents for the good of the children. Obviously, the tribe did this because they really had to. They really didn't have a lot. I'm sure this was like a nobody wins case.
Yeah, they went back and forth, so there's really no winner here. But
Yeah.
they felt like maybe the Supreme Court was siding with the white parents in the way they were wording things. If they were leaning more towards the adoptive parents than the tribal aspect of it, without acknowledging that had the parents actually gone to the tribal and say, hey, we've got these people that want to adopt, the tribe might have went, well, okay.
Yeah, it may have.
Could have said, yeah, no.
It could have said no, but it was probably and probably like the Native American Rights Fund or some other group probably encouraged this lawsuit, because if they didn't, if they just rolled over and let it happen, then that would not, that wouldn't create this boundary for the state.
No, it would just basically make the ICWA
It would rule,
worthless.
It's worthless. So if it's not going to be enforced. but thank goodness it didn't upset the children's homes, unlike the next case. And adoptive couple versus baby girl, this was one that happened close to home. By the way, you ever, when you're reading about this, you wonder, okay, these kids, these little girls, or I think, was it a boy and I think it was a boy and a girl, born in basically 1986. So how old would they be now?
It's not 30s, 40s.
So they would be what, 86, and this is what, 2020. Yeah, so they'd be like 30, 36, I guess. Yeah, they'd be 30, almost 30. Yeah, they'd be 36 now. Anyway, but that's in Mississippi. The next one though, adoptive couple versus baby girl. You know the story about this. Really sad story, but so you have a couple, they're dating, and the guy's in the military. I suppose, you know, this is all taking place in South Carolina, so more than likely, you know, it's probably a Marine in you know, Paris Island, and heading out to Iraq. Okay, and so the guy's deployed. Prior to being deployed, though, the couple, they basically, you know, I think they both split up. Biological mother is non-Indian. Biological father is a member of the Cherokee Nation. Okay, 3/128. Still a member of the Cherokee Nation. Doesn't matter blood quantum, as long as you're connected to the role. So anyway, the child's moved into or gains an adoptive parents, and the adoptive couple has custody of the baby girl, which is processed through South Carolina state courts. We're kind of uncertain about what happened with the obligation of the birth mother to inform the Cherokee Nation. Apparently she did, but maybe didn't. Maybe kind of didn't do it right. Perhaps the tribe got it wrong. I'm not sure. But somehow there was a mix-up. And despite the fact that he waived his parental rights, both on paper and then later by text message, he began to reassert those rights after Cherokee Nation verified that, yeah, the father of this child is a member of the tribe. Did I get that right? Is that the way you all read it?
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Okay. Did you watch the little cartoons that I posted? This was the way the court held that. Samuel Alito, right, wrote the concurring opinion for this one. The court held that several sections of the Indian Child Welfare Act do not apply to Native American biological fathers who are not custodians of a child. So procedures required by the Indian Child Welfare Act to end parental rights do not apply when a child has never lived with the father. Additionally, the requirement to make extra efforts to preserve Native American family does not apply, nor is the preferred placement of the child in another Native American family required when no other party has formally sought to adopt the child. So this was not this was a case where, if you recall what happened, the child went from the adoptive parents to the custody of the father, and then went back to the adoptive parents. So over the course of about 3 years or something like that. So talk about a tearjerker. This is insane. But all right, so what do you all think? I mean, the discussion question here would be, for me, how does the Indian Child Welfare Act affect individual liberty, especially the rights of a parent, rights of a mother, I guess the thing that drew me to this the case was the fact that the biological mother wanted the best for her child in the Mississippi Choctaw case. She wanted the adoptive parents that she selected down in Gulfport to have this child. She didn't want to give up the child to someone in her community, who she didn't want to have someone in her community adopt her child, her biological child. What kind of problems will that bring about? There aren't a lot of secrets in small communities, people don't keep secrets very well, at least. So 200 miles away kind of makes sense, I think, if you're giving a child up for adoption. Hopefully you won't run into the parents or the child again in your life, unless you really want to. And it's pretty easy for children to find their biological parents these days. Sometimes that happens by accident, right? They don't even. When I was doing my 23andMe thing, if you ever try that, I did my 23andMe thing, and I kept getting all these warnings. And it's like, why am I getting all these? But it's like you might discover things that you might not really want to know. All right, but so far nothing. Okay, so that's good. But it was quite interesting to get all of the legal, the legal stuff that popped up. You might discover family members that you don't, and I guess, if you're a child that, was placed into adoption, yeah, you might find out who your relative is. But anyway, I was really distraught by the fact that this law really ran over the rights of the parental rights of the mother, at least in my view. Placed the tribal prerogative above that of a birth mother.
It begs the question, does each tribal nation have to have its own set of regulations involving the adoptions of their own tribal members?
Well, yeah, that's a significant role of a tribal court. Now.
It just, because I would imagine, they had them all lined up. Why would it make, unless there was some really mitigating factor, like we've got to have this Choctaw baby here, why they would not honor the mom's wishes? That just.
They did allow the children to, I think they certainly would allow them to be enrolled members of the tribe.
Oh, it makes sense.
And something else, there was something else I read in the textbook about maybe it was visitation rights, I think. That's just doesn't make sense to me. So yeah, I guess individual tribes can iron out their own policies and do what they want to do.
The original idea of the law was to solve this problem with like Indian children being, taken from the tribe. And it's kind of like a, dissolving the tribe in a way. And so there's this, they have that number in there, that 25-30%. But I'm kind of curious if you actually dug into that number, like what it would reveal, because if it's like 80% in a certain tribe, then that might indicate something different. But certain cases where a mother is perfectly happy with a non-Indian couple adopting the child, honoring the mother's wishes, that clearly should take precedent. But it's kind of like
she took great pains to get 200 miles away from the reservation because she wanted her children to grow up somewhere else.
Right? Yeah, it was intentional, and it was positive for the kid.
Yeah.
But yeah,
and not only that, but both parents were in on it. They were both in agreement.
Yeah. I wonder if they had dug into the situation a little bit more, if they might have, come up with a more inclusive idea, as opposed to just directing their child protective services from the states and the feds to, start doing this.
Yeah.